The Widow of Zarephath, surviving economic collapse through faith and miraculous provision. Its divine echo. Right now, a mother is gathering sticks. Not for warmth. Not for cooking dinner. She's gathering sticks to prepare the last meal she and her son will ever eat. This isn't a dystopian novel. This is a real moment frozen in ancient history that reveals something terrifying about how quickly everything can collapse and something even more shocking about what happens when you make the most counterintuitive decision imaginable in your darkest hour. What would you do if a stranger showed up at your door and demanded you give him the last food in your house, the food that stands between your child and starvation? Would you slam the door? Call security? Or would you do what this widow did, something so logical that it defies every survival instinct we possess? Because what happened next didn't just save her life. It rewrote the rules of how provision actually works. The reality of total system failure. Let me paint the picture of what was actually happening in the ancient Near East around 850 BCE. This wasn't a bad harvest season. This was what happens when the entire system collapses. The region of Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon, and parts of Syria was experiencing a drought so severe that the biblical text describes it as lasting 3.5 years. According to archaeological evidence from climate studies of the Levant region, droughts of this magnitude would have caused complete agricultural failure, mass livestock death, and the breakdown of trade networks. Think about our 2024 global supply chain crisis: empty shelves, inflation, panic buying. Now multiply that by 1,000. No grocery stores. No emergency services. No government aid packages. When the drought came, it didn't just mean less food. It meant the complete erasure of economic activity. The regional economy in the ancient Near East was almost entirely agricultural. When crops failed for 3 consecutive growing seasons, there was no backup system. No strategic reserves. No international relief organizations. This widow in Zarephath wasn't struggling. She had crossed the threshold from poverty into terminal deprivation. The Hebrew phrase describing her situation literally translates to gathering a couple of sticks, not bundles, not armloads, to pieces of wood, just enough to cook one small cake of bread. Archaeologists who study ancient Near Eastern cooking methods note that baking required sustained heat, meaning she was conserving even fire. She had calculated down to the exact amount of fuel needed because there would be no tomorrow requiring resources. But here's what makes this moment psychologically devastating: she wasn't alone in her suffering. The entire city of Zarephath was dying. When everyone around you is starving, there's a strange comfort in shared despair. You're not failing, the world is failing. Yet this also means there's no neighbor to borrow from, no community safety net, no last resort option. The social fabric that normally catches people in crisis had completely disintegrated. Now ask yourself, what modern parallel exists? Look at Venezuela's economic collapse between 2013 and 2020, where hyperinflation reached 1,000,000%. And citizens lost an average of £24 due to food scarcity. Or consider the 2020 to Sri Lankan economic crisis when the government defaulted and citizens couldn't access basic necessities. These aren't ancient history, they're contemporary reminders that total system failure remains possible. And in every case, the final psychological burden falls on parents watching their children suffer. The paradox of the final request. Here's where the story takes a turn that should make you uncomfortable, because if you're not uncomfortable, you're not really grasping what's happening. The prophet Elijah appears at the city gate. But he doesn't arrive with supplies. He doesn't have a caravan of grain or a miraculous fishing technique. He arrives thirsty, hungry, and desperate himself. The text is explicit. He asked for water first, then bread. He's adding to the burden, not relieving it. Now imagine this from the widow's perspective. You've already made peace with death. You've already had that conversation with your son, the one where you explain as gently as possible that the bread you're about to make is the last. You've compartmentalized your grief into functional numbness just to get through the next hour. And then a foreign prophet, a representative of the God of Israel, not even your own deity, makes a demand so audacious it borders on cruelty. Make me a small cake of bread first, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. First, not also. Not if you have extra. First. The Hebrew word here is rishona, meaning in priority, in sequence, before anything else. This isn't a request. It's a command that violates every principle of survival ethics. Ethicists who study moral decision-making in crisis situations identify what they call the lifeboat problem. When resources are scarce, who gets priority? The consensus across cultures and throughout history is clear: children first, then women, then providers. Strangers come last, if at all. Elijah's request reverses this completely. He's not asking for leftovers. He's asking for first fruits from a harvest that doesn't exist. He's requesting a sacrifice from someone who has nothing left to sacrifice. Here's what makes this psychologically complex. Scarcity creates hoarding instincts that are neurologically hardwired. Studies from behavioral economics show that when people perceive scarcity, whether it's food, money, or time, their cognitive function actually narrows. They lose the capacity for long-term thinking and become hyper-focused on immediate survival. This is called a scarcity mindset, and it's measurable in brain scans. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, shows reduced activity under conditions of extreme scarcity. So, when Elijah makes this request, he's asking the widow to override her brain's emergency protocol. He's asking her to think beyond survival mode when survival mode is the only thing keeping her functional. And yet, and this is crucial, he makes a promise. The jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. The mechanics of miraculous continuity. What happens next isn't what most people expect from a miracle. The widow makes the bread for Elijah first. And the text tells us, she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of meal was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord. Notice what didn't happen. The jar didn't overflow. She didn't wake up to a warehouse full of grain. The miracle wasn't abundance, it was sufficiency. Every single day, there was just enough. Not stockpiles. Not surplus. Just enough. This is what theologians call manna economics, referencing the Israelites in the wilderness who received daily bread that couldn't be stored or hoarded. The miracle required daily participation. She had to bake bread every day, using faith every day, trusting that tomorrow's provision would appear tomorrow. This is radically different from our economic models. Modern financial planning is built on accumulation, savings accounts, investment portfolios, retirement funds. We're taught to store up for future uncertainty. The widow's miracle operated on the opposite principle: daily dependence, continuous trust, sustained relationship with the source of provision. Dr. Jacques Ellul, the French philosopher and theologian, wrote extensively about what he called the economics of grace. He argued that divine provision operates on fundamentally different principles than human economic systems. Where human economics requires scarcity to create value, grace operates from abundance. Where human systems demand accumulation for security, grace offers sufficiency without hoarding. But here's the part that's relevant to us in 2026. The widow's miracle wasn't passive. She didn't stop working. She didn't stop baking. She didn't become dependent in the modern sense. The miracle sustained her agency. She was still the one making bread, still feeding her household, still participating in the act of provision. The supernatural element was the impossibility of the resources depleting, not the elimination of her role. Contemporary economists studying resilience in developing nations have identified what they call social sustainability, the idea that communities survive crisis not through individual stockpiling, but through networks of reciprocal support. The widow's story illustrates spiritual sustainability. She survived not through what she hoarded, but through what she gave away first, architecting a legacy of provision. So, what does an ancient widow's survival story have to do with navigating uncertainty in 2026? Everything. Because the principles underlying her provision are the exact opposite of what our culture teaches about security. We're told to accumulate, to protect assets, to prioritize our own needs first, especially in crisis. The widow's story suggests that the pathway to sustained provision runs through radical, even illogical, generosity. But let's be clear about what this isn't. This isn't prosperity gospel theology that claims God is a cosmic vending machine dispensing wealth to those who give donations. This isn't name it, claim it spirituality. The widow didn't get rich. She got sustained. There's a massive difference. What she discovered was a principle that operates regardless of economic conditions. When you participate in a system of generous circulation rather than fearful hoarding, you access provision beyond what your visible resources suggest is possible. Think about it practically. In 2023, a study by the Journal of Economic Psychology found that people who maintained charitable giving during economic downturns reported higher levels of psychological resilience and life satisfaction than those who cut all giving to protect personal resources. Generosity doesn't just help others, it fundamentally rewires how you relate to scarcity. Here's your challenge. Identify your handful of flour. What's the thing you're holding onto because you're convinced that if you let it go, you'll have nothing left? Maybe it's time. Maybe it's a specific skill you're hoarding rather than sharing. Maybe it's literal financial resources you're paralyzed to use generously because of fear. The widow's miracle began when she gave away the last thing she had, not the first thing, not surplus, the last thing. That's not reckless irresponsibility. That's radical trust that provision comes from a source beyond visible supply chains. And in a world where supply chains are increasingly fragile, where inflation continues eroding purchasing power, where traditional economic security feels increasingly unstable, maybe the widow's ancient strategy is the most practical approach available. The jar didn't run empty for many days. The drought eventually ended, normal economic activity resumed, and presumably the miracle stopped being necessary. But the widow survived what should have killed her. And she survived not by protecting what she had, but by giving it away first. So, here's the question you need to answer. What are you gathering sticks for? What final meal are you preparing in your mind because you're convinced the system is about to fail you completely? And what would happen if, instead of hoarding that last handful, you gave it away first and watched what happens next? The widow discovered that the end of human resources is where divine provision begins. Maybe it's time we stop treating that as ancient mythology and start testing it as contemporary strategy.